By 1942, the Pacific was a battleground where every island, every stretch of ocean, and every engagement could shift the tide of war. The Solomon Islands, once an obscure archipelago, became the stage for a brutal conflict between American and Japanese forces. What began as a desperate foothold on Guadalcanal soon evolved into an unrelenting offensive as the United States sought to push Japan out of the region. This is the story of the escalating American offensive in the Solomons, a campaign that would test the limits of endurance, strategy, and sheer firepower. The invasion of Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, marked the first major offensive by the United States in the Pacific. It was a bold and necessary move, aimed at halting Japan's expansion and securing a strategic foothold in the Solomon Islands. The island's location made it a critical point for controlling supply routes, and both sides recognized its importance. The Americans knew that allowing Japan to establish a firm presence there would give them a significant advantage in the Pacific, one that could threaten Australia and further disrupt Allied movements. Taking Guadalcanal was not just about one battle. It was about shifting the momentum of the entire war. As the sun rose that morning, the skies above the island filled with the roar of aircraft, and the sea trembled under the weight of warships moving into position. U.S. Marines stormed the beaches, braving the unknown as they pushed inland. At first, resistance was lighter than expected. The Japanese defenders had not fully fortified their positions, allowing American forces to capture Henderson Field, a crucial airstrip that would become the focal point of the campaign. Securing the airfield gave the Allies a staging ground for air operations, but holding it would prove to be an even greater challenge. As the Marines dug in, the Japanese launched a fierce counteroffensive. Determined to reclaim the airfield, they launched a series of relentless attacks. Under the cover of darkness, waves of enemy soldiers surged through the dense jungle, attempting to overrun American positions. The fighting was brutal, a test of endurance as much as firepower. The thick vegetation and rugged terrain made traditional tactics difficult, forcing both sides into grueling hand-to-hand combat. Every inch of ground was fought over with determination, neither side willing to concede. The nights were filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the desperate cries of wounded men. Beyond the jungle, the waters surrounding Guadalcanal became a deadly battleground. The Japanese Navy, seeking to reinforce their troops on the island, launched aggressive naval operations. American warships were drawn into some of the most intense surface battles of the war, fighting under the cover of night in chaotic engagements where visibility was limited and survival depended on quick decisions. Ships clashed in close-range combat, torpedoes streaked through the dark waters, and entire vessels were lost within minutes. The Battle of Rabaul Island was one such confrontation, where a powerful Japanese force caught the Allies off guard, inflicting devastating losses on American and Australian warships. The price of controlling the Solomons was steep, and Guadalcanal became a proving ground for naval resilience and adaptability. On land, the Marines faced another relentless challenge: supply shortages. With the Japanese fleet controlling the surrounding waters at night, getting reinforcements and provisions to the island became a dangerous task. The men on the front lines often fought hungry and exhausted, relying on whatever rations and ammunition they could secure. Disease also took its toll. The humid jungle climate, combined with the lack of clean water, led to widespread cases of malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections. Despite these hardships, they held their positions, knowing that retreat was not an option. The Japanese, too, suffered immense losses. Their strategy relied on night attacks and relentless assaults, but as weeks turned into months, their numbers dwindled. They underestimated the resilience of the American forces, and every failed attack weakened their ability to sustain the fight. U.S. reinforcements slowly arrived, bringing more men, supplies, and firepower. With each passing day, the balance shifted further in favor of the Allies. The control of Henderson Field allowed American aircraft to patrol the skies, intercepting Japanese reinforcements and striking enemy positions with devastating accuracy. By February 1943, after 6 months of relentless combat, the Japanese High Command made a fateful decision. Realizing that Guadalcanal was no longer tenable, they ordered an organized withdrawal. The once mighty force that had sought to dominate the Pacific had been forced to retreat, leaving behind thousands of fallen soldiers and the shattered remnants of their campaign. The American victory at Guadalcanal was more than just a territorial gain. It was a psychological and strategic turning point. It marked the first time Japan had lost a major island battle, and it proved that they were not invincible. For the men who fought there, Guadalcanal was more than just a name on a map. It was a nightmare of endless combat, unrelenting hardship, and the ultimate test of survival. It was a battlefield where courage was measured not just in victories, but in the ability to endure the unthinkable. It set the stage for the broader campaign in the Solomons, proving that the United States was no longer fighting a defensive war, but had taken the initiative in reclaiming the Pacific. The road ahead was long, but Guadalcanal had shown that the tide of war was turning. As American forces prepared to press forward, their resolve was stronger than ever. The lessons learned from the jungles and beaches of Guadalcanal would shape their strategy in future battles. They had faced the full force of the Japanese military and emerged victorious. The Solomons campaign was just beginning, but the momentum had shifted. The battle for the Pacific was now on America's terms, and the enemy was beginning to realize that their time was running out. With Guadalcanal secured, the momentum of the war in the Pacific began to shift. What had started as a desperate struggle to hold a single airstrip had evolved into a broader strategy aimed at pushing the Japanese back across the Solomon Islands. The victory at Guadalcanal had proven that American forces could withstand the enemy's ferocity, and now the objective was to build on that success. The war was no longer about holding ground but about taking it. Each island in the Solomons presented a new challenge, a new test of endurance, but the lessons learned from months of brutal combat had shaped a force that was now ready to go on the offensive. The next targets lay to the northwest. Japanese forces had established heavily fortified positions on islands like New Georgia and Bougainville, determined to resist any further advances. Their defenses were extensive, consisting of reinforced bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and networks of caves that provided both protection and concealment. These strongholds had to be dismantled piece by piece. The Americans adopted an aggressive approach, combining amphibious landings with aerial bombardments to weaken enemy positions before troops even set foot on the beaches. Naval firepower played a crucial role, as destroyers and cruisers unleashed a relentless barrage, softening defenses before the soldiers moved in. The landings themselves were chaotic, marked by fierce resistance and unpredictable enemy movements. Japanese troops, knowing they could not match the sheer numbers of the invading force, resorted to guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and elaborate defensive traps. Fighting in the dense jungle was a different kind of warfare. The terrain was unforgiving, riddled with obstacles that slowed progress and made every step a potential death trap. Soldiers navigated through thick undergrowth, where visibility was limited, and the sounds of distant gunfire echoed ominously. Combat was up close, fought in trenches, foxholes, and narrow trails where engagements could turn deadly in an instant. Despite the difficulties, American troops pressed forward, adapting to the conditions with every battle. Flamethrowers and grenades became essential tools for clearing enemy fortifications, while coordinated assaults ensured that Japanese forces could not regroup. Aerial dominance was another key factor. American pilots controlled the skies, launching relentless attacks on enemy supply lines and preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. Air superiority meant that Japanese troops on the ground were often left stranded, cut off from resupply and unable to retreat. The Navy played an equally important role in ensuring the success of these landings. Convoys carrying troops and equipment had to be protected at all costs, as Japanese submarines and aircraft attempted to disrupt the supply lines. Every battle was fought on multiple fronts, with engagements occurring simultaneously in the air, at sea, and on land. The coordination between these different elements was vital to the success of the offensive. It was no longer just about individual victories, but about executing a larger plan that would systematically dismantle Japan's hold on the Solomons. The campaign was relentless. As soon as one island was secured, the focus shifted to the next. The Americans did not give their enemy time to recover. Each victory put more pressure on the Japanese, forcing them into defensive positions that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Morale among their troops began to waver as they saw their strongholds fall one by one. The reality of the war was becoming clear. Their empire was shrinking. Their dominance was fading. The island-hopping strategy was proving effective, though it came at a high cost. Casualties mounted with each battle, and the brutal conditions took their toll on both sides. Disease remained a constant threat, as malaria and tropical infections spread rapidly through the ranks. Soldiers faced exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological strain of endless combat. Yet, they pushed forward, knowing that every step brought them closer to the final objective. As the campaign progressed, intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were shifting their strategy. They had begun to consolidate their remaining forces around key strongholds, hoping to make a final stand at locations like Rabaul. This changed the nature of the fight. The enemy was no longer attempting to expand, but was now desperately trying to hold what little ground remained. It was a sign that their resources were dwindling, and that the American offensive was succeeding in wearing them down. Each battle was a lesson, each island a stepping stone toward a larger victory. The campaign in the Solomons had begun as a defensive struggle, but it had transformed into a calculated push that left the enemy with fewer and fewer options. The war was turning, and the once dominant Japanese forces were now on the defensive. The path ahead was still difficult, but the direction was clear. The Pacific was no longer their domain. It belonged to those who fought relentlessly, who adapted to the challenges, and who refused to back down. The offensive would continue, and with every island taken, the end of the war drew close. The battles on land were fierce, but the struggle for control over the surrounding waters was just as critical. The Solomon Islands campaign was not just about securing territory. It was about cutting off enemy reinforcements and ensuring that supply lines remained intact. The waters around the islands became the scene of some of the most intense naval engagements of the war. The U.S. Navy, recognizing the importance of maintaining dominance at sea, committed its warships to a relentless effort to neutralize the Japanese fleet. Japanese forces relied heavily on nighttime operations, using the cover of darkness to move reinforcements and supplies through what became known as the Tokyo Express, a network of fast-moving destroyers and transport vessels that slipped through the waters, attempting to evade American patrols. The U.S. Navy quickly adapted, deploying radar-equipped ships to detect and engage the enemy before they could reach their intended destinations. This technological advantage gave American forces an edge, allowing them to strike first in engagements where visibility was otherwise non-existent. The waters of the Solomon Islands became a battlefield of their own. Each encounter carried immense stakes, as losing a naval engagement meant exposing ground troops to the possibility of being cut off or overwhelmed. The battles that unfolded were violent, fast-paced, and decisive. Torpedoes streaked through the dark waters, finding their marks with devastating effect. Shells tore through steel hulls, sending ships to the depths within minutes. Crews fought desperately to keep their vessels afloat, battling fire and flooding while counterattacking with everything they had. One of the most significant battles of this phase was the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese warships clashed in a chaotic, close-quarters engagement. The intensity of the battle tested the resolve of every sailor involved. Ships engaged at dangerously close distances, exchanging heavy fire under the eerie glow of explosions illuminating the night sky. The damage inflicted on both sides was severe, but the Japanese fleet suffered losses they could not afford. The battle demonstrated that the U.S. Navy had not only matched, but had begun to surpass its adversary in skill, firepower, and strategic execution. Air superiority played a crucial role in these engagements. American aircraft from Henderson Field and carriers operating in the area launched repeated strikes on Japanese convoys and warships. Dive bombers and torpedo planes became the scourge of enemy vessels, crippling ships before they could reach their intended destinations. The ability to strike from the air forced Japanese forces to rethink their tactics, as every attempted reinforcement mission now carried the near certainty of being intercepted. The Japanese response was increasingly desperate. Without the ability to resupply their forces effectively, they resorted to sending in submarines and smaller vessels under cover of darkness, But even these efforts met resistance. The U.S. Navy had established a near-constant presence, tracking movements and striking at the most opportune moments. The campaign had shifted beyond just winning individual battles. It was now a war of attrition, one that Japan could not sustain. As control over the seas solidified, American forces were able to move more freely, transporting fresh troops, supplies, and reinforcements to continue the offensive. The advantage at sea translated directly to success on land, as Marines and soldiers fighting in the jungles could now rely on a steady flow of resources to sustain their momentum. What had once been a struggle for survival was now an orchestrated push forward, where every element of the military worked in unison. The Japanese fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific, was now struggling to maintain its foothold. The loss of key warships and the inability to counter American naval advancements left them with fewer strategic options. Battleships and cruisers that had once commanded fear were now being sunk with increasing regularity. The tide had turned, and the initiative was firmly in American hands. The constant pressure exerted on enemy forces took its toll. Japanese commanders, recognizing that their fleet could no longer operate effectively in the region, began shifting their priorities. Instead of attempting to retake lost positions, they focused on delaying American advances, hoping to buy time to regroup and reinforce elsewhere. This change in strategy signaled an important shift. The once aggressive expansionist force was now playing defense, struggling to hold onto what little remained of their territorial gains. The lessons learned in these naval battles would shape future engagements. The ability to coordinate air, sea, and land forces proved invaluable, reinforcing the importance of integrated warfare. The success of American naval operations in the Solomon Islands campaign set the stage for even greater victories to come. The dominance at sea allowed for an unimpeded push deeper into Japanese-held territory, ensuring that the war would continue to progress toward the ultimate objective. For those who fought in the waters of the Solomon Islands, the experience was unlike any other. Every battle was fought with the knowledge that defeat could mean the loss of everything gained. The sailors and aviators who engaged the enemy in these high-stakes encounters understood that they were shaping the outcome of the war with every action they took. The victories at sea were not just military successes. They were steps toward the eventual end of the conflict. The enemy had once dictated the terms of battle, but that era had ended. The Americans had seized the initiative, and they were not going to relinquish it. The campaign was far from over, but the course of the war had changed irreversibly. The Japanese fleet had been battered, their supply lines severed, and their ability to wage an effective fight in the region had been crippled. The Solomons had become a proving ground, and from this experience, the path forward had been made clear. The offensive would continue, and with every battle won, the Pacific inched closer to final victory. The momentum gained through hard-fought naval battles in the Solomon Islands was not just a temporary advantage. It was the foundation for the next phase of the war. The enemy, now struggling to reinforce their forces, found themselves on the defensive in a conflict that was once theirs to control. The relentless pressure applied by American forces ensured that the initiative remained firmly in Allied hands. With each victory, the noose tightened around Japanese strongholds, and the final push toward their most critical positions became inevitable. As the campaign progressed, one objective loomed larger than the rest: Rabaul. Situated at the northeastern tip of New Britain, this heavily fortified base served as a major operational hub for the Japanese military. It housed a powerful garrison, airfields filled with enemy aircraft, and a harbor that allowed warships to resupply and repair. Control of this stronghold allowed Japan to project power across the Pacific, making it an essential target in the broader strategy of dismantling their empire. However, rather than launching a costly frontal assault, the Americans devised a plan to isolate and neutralize it through relentless air and naval attacks. The strategy of bypassing heavily defended positions had already proven effective in previous battles, and Rabaul was no exception. Bombing raids were conducted with increasing intensity, each wave of aircraft delivering devastating blows to airfields, supply depots, and defensive structures. Fighter squadrons swept across the skies, engaging enemy planes in vicious dogfights, gradually wearing down Japanese air power. Every successful strike reduced the effectiveness of Rabaul's defenders, limiting their ability to launch counterattacks or support other forces in the region. The effectiveness of these operations was undeniable. Without reinforcements or steady supplies, the once powerful stronghold became a shadow of what it had been. The strategy of isolation, rather than direct confrontation, ensured that American forces could continue their advance without suffering unnecessary casualties. This was a war of attrition, one that Japan could no longer sustain. Their military machine, once seemingly unstoppable, was now fractured, with vital positions being starved of resources and support. With Rabaul effectively neutralized, the focus shifted toward pushing deeper into enemy territory. The lessons learned in the Solomons campaign had reshaped the approach to war in the Pacific. The necessity of maintaining air superiority, the importance of controlling supply routes, and the value of coordinated assaults had all been reinforced through experience. The ability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations had improved significantly, ensuring that future invasions would be executed with even greater efficiency. American forces, now battle-hardened and confident, pressed forward with renewed determination. The war was far from over, but the advantage gained in the Solomons had fundamentally altered the course of the conflict. What had once seemed like an uphill battle was now a path toward inevitable victory. The Japanese forces, though still dangerous, were now fighting a defensive war, desperately trying to hold onto what little remained of their once vast empire. For the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had fought in these battles, the campaign was more than a series of victories. It was proof that the sacrifices made along the way had been necessary to secure the future. Each battle had tested their endurance, and each loss had reinforced the need to keep pushing forward. The war had demanded everything from them, and they had met the challenge with unwavering determination. The Solomon Islands campaign had been long and brutal, but its success meant that the tide of war had shifted irreversibly. Japan had been forced into a position they could not recover from, and the Allied advance was now unstoppable. The strategy developed through these hard-fought battles would continue to shape the final phases of the war, ensuring that the enemy's grip on the Pacific would be completely dismantled. As American forces moved toward the next objectives, there was a sense of purpose that had not been there at the beginning of the war. The victories in the Solomons were not just strategic, they were symbolic of a greater shift. The time of Japanese dominance in the Pacific was over. The enemy that had once dictated the terms of engagement was now forced to react, struggling to maintain what little control they had left. The war was still far from finished, but the end was beginning to take shape on the horizon. The soldiers and sailors who had fought through the jungles and across the seas of the Solomon Islands knew that history had been written in blood and sacrifice. Every step forward had come at a cost, and every life lost had contributed to a greater cause. The lessons of this campaign would not be forgotten, and the determination forged in these battles would carry through to the final days of the war. The Solomons had been a proving ground, a place where the resilience of the American military had been tested and strengthened. It was here that the tide had turned, where the war had begun to shift in favor of those who refused to back down. The battles had been won, but the fight was not yet over. The enemy still had strongholds, still had forces willing to resist. But the momentum was now unstoppable, and nothing would prevent the final victory from coming. The path to the end had been set, and those who had fought in the Solomons had ensured that it would lead to nothing less than total triumph. The battles that had raged across the Solomon Islands were now part of history. Their echoes still felt in the strategies shaping the final phase of the war. What had begun as a desperate struggle to hold ground had transformed into a relentless advance, one that had shattered the enemy's ability to wage war on their own terms. The victories achieved were not just measured in territory gained, but in the growing realization that Japan's grip on the Pacific was slipping away. Each step forward brought the Allied forces closer to the ultimate goal, and there was no doubt that the tide had turned for good. The campaign had been grueling, fought in the depths of the jungle, on blood-stained beaches, and across the treacherous waters where warships clashed in the dead of night. The lessons learned in those hard-fought battles had reshaped the approach to war, reinforcing the importance of coordination between air, land, and sea forces. The soldiers who had endured the harsh conditions and constant danger carried with them the knowledge that they had helped shape the course of history. They had seen firsthand the cost of war, had lost friends, and had pushed forward despite exhaustion and uncertainty. Their sacrifices had not been in vain. With the Solomons secured and the enemy's forces in retreat, the next phase of the campaign took shape. The strategy that had proven so effective in these battles would now be used on an even greater scale. The experience gained in amphibious landings, coordinated airstrikes, and naval engagements would guide the offensives that would push deeper into the heart of the Pacific. The war was no longer about holding the line. It was about dismantling the enemy's remaining strongholds until there was nowhere left for them to run. The Japanese forces, once feared for their unrelenting aggression, were now fighting to survive. Their supply lines had been cut, their warships decimated, and their once dominant air power reduced to desperate counterattacks. They had fought fiercely, unwilling to concede defeat, but the reality was undeniable. Every engagement they lost weakened them further, and their ability to launch new offensives had been stripped away. They were now reacting, not initiating, their strategies dictated by the overwhelming force pushing them back. The empire they had sought to expand was shrinking with every passing battle. As the American forces prepared for the next stage of the war, they did so with confidence. They had faced the enemy in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable and had emerged victorious. They had learned to adapt, to fight in terrain that was as deadly as the soldiers opposing them. They had seen what the enemy was capable of and had found ways to counter every tactic used against them. The war was not yet over, but there was no longer any question about the outcome. The path to victory had been laid, and it was now just a matter of time before the final battles were fought. For the men who had fought in the Solomons, the memories of those battles would never fade. They had seen their comrades fall, had endured the relentless hardships of war, and had faced death more times than they could count. Yet they had never wavered. They had fought with determination, knowing that every island taken, every battle won, brought them one step closer to ending the conflict. Their courage had shaped the course of history, and their efforts had paved the way for the final push that would bring the war to its conclusion. The enemy had once seemed unstoppable, their forces sweeping across the Pacific in a wave of conquest that had threatened the balance of power. But that time had passed. The battles in the Solomons had been a turning point, a moment when the momentum shifted irrevocably. Japan was no longer on the offensive, and the strength they had once relied upon was now crumbling under the weight of sustained, coordinated attacks. The Pacific, once dominated by their warships and aircraft, now belonged to those who had fought relentlessly to take it back. As the war moved closer to its final stage, the significance of what had been accomplished in the Solomons became clear. This campaign had not just been a series of battles. It had been the foundation for the ultimate victory. The hard lessons learned, the strategies refined, and the experience gained had prepared the forces for what lay ahead. The sacrifices made in the jungles, on the beaches, and in the waters surrounding those islands had not been for nothing. They had been the price paid to turn the tide, to ensure that the future belonged to those who had fought for it. The war would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The enemy's ability to resist was fading, their forces stretched beyond their limits. The final battles would be hard-fought, but they would end in only one way. The offensive that had begun in the Solomons had set the course for the rest of the war. The road to victory had been carved through blood and determination, and now, with the enemy weakened and retreating, that road led straight to the heart of their empire. For those who had fought in the Solomons, there was no need for grand speeches or celebrations. They knew what they had accomplished, and they knew what it had cost. Their battle had been one of endurance, of relentless pressure that had broken the enemy's hold on the Pacific. They had done their part, and now others would carry the fight forward. The war was nearing its end, and when the final shot was fired, when the last battle was won, they would know that it had all started here. In the jungles, on the beaches, and in the waters where the Solomons had been reclaimed, the tide had turned, and the future had been decided.